The sky burned orange and red as Sergeant Marcus Cole moved through the broken streets of the alien city, his rifle held tight against his chest, his eyes scanning every shadow and every corner for movement. 3 years of war had taught him to trust nothing and no one on these worlds. And the lesson had cost him friends and brothers in arms who would never go home again. The Valori had started this war when they attacked human colonies without warning, burning 2 entire worlds from orbit and killing millions of innocent people who had never even heard of the Valori Dominion before that terrible day. Now humanity had pushed back across the stars, and the Valori were learning a hard truth about the species they had once called soft prey. Marcus led his fire team of 4 soldiers through a plaza where alien trees had been turned to ash, and strange statues lay shattered on the ground, their meaning lost forever in the chaos of battle. Private Chun walked 3 meters to his left, her weapon sweeping the windows of ruined buildings that rose like broken teeth against the burning sky. Corporal Vasquez moved to his right, the red cross on her shoulder marking her as the squad medic, though she carried a rifle just like everyone else, because in this war there were no safe positions. Private Torres brought up the rear, a big man with steady hands and eyes that had seen too much death to show any emotion anymore. Their boots crunched on broken glass and fallen debris as they advanced through the district, following orders to clear every building and eliminate any enemy resistance they found. Command had told them this sector contained military targets, administrative buildings where Valori officers planned their campaigns and stored their secrets. And Marcus had no reason to doubt the intelligence. The Valori were insectoid creatures that stood taller than humans, with hard shells covering their bodies and large compound eyes that seemed to glow in certain light. And they had proven themselves deadly enemies in close combat. Their claws could tear through standard armor, and their reflexes were faster than anything humans had evolved to fight. But humanity had adapted as humanity always did. They had developed new weapons and new tactics, learned to use their numbers and their stubborn refusal to surrender. And slowly they had turned the tide of the war. Marcus remembered the early days when human forces had retreated from system to system, when it seemed like nothing could stop the Valori advance, when people back home had started to whisper that maybe this enemy was too strong. But humans did not give up. And humans did not forget. And humans did not forgive the murder of millions. The counterattack had begun 18 months ago. And now human boots walked on Valori worlds for the first time. And it was the enemy who tasted fear. Marcus felt no joy in this, only a grim satisfaction that the beings who had killed so many innocent people were finally facing justice for their crimes. He had lost his younger brother David in the attack on New Helsinki, a colony world that had been home to 3 million people before the Valori turned it into a ball of radioactive glass. David had been 22 years old, a teacher who worked with children in a small town near the colony's northern sea, and he had never held a weapon in his life. Marcus thought about David every time he pulled the trigger, and the memory gave him strength when his body wanted to quit and his mind wanted to forget why he was fighting. The squad reached a wide street that had once been beautiful, lined with strange alien plants and decorated with hanging lights that now swung broken in the hot wind from distant fires. Marcus held up his fist, signaling the squad to stop, and they froze in place like statues while he studied the terrain ahead. His motion tracker showed nothing, but that meant little against the Valori, who had learned to mask their heat signatures and move in ways that confused human sensors. He trusted his eyes more than any machine, and his eyes told him something was wrong about the building at the end of the street. It was larger than the others, built from pale stone that had cracked and blackened from nearby explosions, and part of its upper floors had collapsed into rubble. But there was something about the way the shadows fell across its entrance, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up in warning. "I don't like it," Chun whispered through the cum, her voice tight with tension. "Neither do I," Marcus replied. "But we have orders. And that building is on our list." He checked his ammunition and made sure his combat knife was loose in its sheath, because he had learned that sometimes guns were not enough. When the Valori got close, Vasquez moved up beside him, her dark eyes studying the building with the same suspicion he felt. "Could be an ambush," she said quietly. "Could be nothing, but I've got a bad feeling about this one." "Sarge," Marcus nodded, appreciating her honesty, even as he knew it changed nothing about what they had to do. War did not care about feelings or instincts, or the small voice inside that told you to run away and never look back. War only cared about objectives and orders and the cold mathematics of victory and defeat. "We go in standard formation," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his gut. "Chun takes point. I follow. Vasquez in the middle. Torres covers our exit. And we clear it room by room." His squad acknowledged with quiet clicks on their comms, and they began moving toward the building with the careful precision of soldiers who had done this 100 times before. The entrance yawned before them like a dark mouth, and Marcus could see nothing inside but shadows and the faint outline of broken furniture scattered across the floor. Chun stepped through first, her rifle light cutting through the darkness, and Marcus followed 3 seconds later with his own weapon raised and ready. The air inside smelled like smoke and something else, something organic and strange that reminded Marcus of the enemy soldiers he had killed in close combat. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the task at hand, scanning corners and doorways. As the squad moved deeper into the structure, his motion trackers suddenly beeped, showing 2 contacts ahead, one large and one small. And Marcus felt his heart rate increase as adrenaline flooded his system. "Contact," he whispered. "2 signatures next room. Be ready for anything." The squad stacked up on the doorway, and Marcus counted down silently before they burst through into whatever waited on the other side. He had no idea that the next few seconds would change his life forever, and that everything he thought he knew about war and enemies and mercy was about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined. Marcus burst through the doorway with his rifle raised and his finger ready on the trigger, every muscle in his body prepared for the violence that had become as natural as breathing over 3 years of brutal war. Chun moved beside him, a weapon light sweeping across the room and illuminating walls covered with strange alien writing and pictures that meant nothing to human eyes. The room had once been some kind of office or study, with a large desk made of dark material pushed against one wall and shelves filled with objects that had fallen and shattered during the fighting. But Marcus saw none of these details because his attention locked onto the 2 figures huddled in the far corner. And what he saw made his brain struggle to understand. What his eyes were telling him, a Valori soldier sat slumped against the wall, his hard shell cracked and leaking the blue-green fluid that served as blood for his species, his compound eyes dim and unfocused with pain. The soldier wore the uniform of a junior officer, and Marcus could see a weapon lying on the ground several meters away, too far for the wounded alien to reach even if he had the strength to try. But it was not the soldier that made Marcus hesitate with his finger frozen on the trigger. Standing between Marcus and the wounded Valori was a child. Marcus had never seen a Valori child before, had never even thought about whether they existed, because in war you did not think about your enemy as beings with families and young ones and lives beyond the battlefield. The child was tiny, reaching only to Marcus's waist, with a shell that looked soft and pale compared to the hard armor of adult Valori, and enormous eyes that reflected the light from the human weapons. Those eyes were filled with terror, a pure and simple fear that Marcus recognized instantly because he had seen the same expression on human children during evacuations and refugee movements. The child spread its small arms wide, placing its fragile body between the human soldiers and its wounded father. And the gesture was so universal that it struck Marcus like a physical blow. "Please," the child said, its voice high and trembling as the translator device on its collar converted the alien sounds into words Marcus could understand. "Please do not kill my father." The room went completely silent except for the distant sounds of battle and the harsh breathing of soldiers who had expected combat and found something entirely different. Chun's weapon remained raised, her training keeping her ready to fire, even as confusion played across her face. And Torres stood in the doorway with his rifle pointed at the small alien that stood trembling before them. Marcus stared at the child, and the child stared back at him. And in that moment, something shifted inside his chest that he could not name or explain. He had killed Valori before without hesitation or remorse, had watched them fall and felt nothing but satisfaction that his enemy was one less threat to humanity. He had told himself that they were monsters, that they deserved death for what they had done to human colonies. That mercy was weakness in a war for survival. But this was not a monster standing before him. This was a child trying to protect its parent with nothing but its small body and desperate words. And Marcus could not pretend otherwise, no matter how much easier that would have made things. "Sarge," Chen whispered, her voice uncertain. "What do we do?" Marcus did not answer immediately because he genuinely did not know. And the weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical force. His orders were clear: eliminate all enemy combatants and secure the sector. And the wounded soldier in the corner was definitely an enemy combatant who would kill them all if he had the chance and the strength, but his orders said nothing about children, because no one had imagined that human soldiers would encounter Valori young ones in the middle of a war zone. The child had not moved, still standing with its arms spread wide in a gesture of protection that could do nothing against human weapons, but meant everything about courage and love. Its small body trembled visibly, and Marcus realized that the child knew exactly how powerless it was, knew that these strange alien invaders could end its life with a single pull of the trigger, and still it stood there, refusing to abandon its father, even in the face of certain death. Marcus thought about David, his brother who had died on New Helsinki, who had spent his short life teaching children and believing that kindness mattered more than strength. David would have been horrified to see Marcus pointing a weapon at a child, no matter what species that child belonged to. And the thought sent a wave of shame through Marcus's body. He remembered conversations they had shared during visits home, arguments about the war and what it was doing to humanity, and David's quiet insistence that they must not become the monsters they were fighting. "We have to be better than them," David had said during their last conversation, just weeks before the attack that killed him, "because if we become like them, then they have already won, even if we destroy them all." Marcus had dismissed those words as naive idealism from someone who had never faced the enemy in combat. But standing here now with a terrified child before him, he understood what his brother had meant. The Valori had shown no mercy when they burned human colonies, had not cared about the children they killed when they turned worlds to glass. And by every law of war, Marcus would be justified in returning that cruelty. But being justified was not the same as being right. And Marcus finally understood the difference. His rifle lowered slowly, the movement feeling strange after so many months of instant combat reflexes. And he heard Chun make a small sound of surprise beside him. "Stand down," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotions he could not fully identify. "What?" Torres asked from the doorway, his tone suggesting he thought Marcus had lost his mind. "I said stand down," Marcus repeated, louder this time, and he put all the authority of his rank into the words. "Weapons down, all of you, right now." Chun lowered her rifle immediately, trusting her sergeant even if she did not understand his reasoning. And after a long moment, Torres did the same with obvious reluctance. The child watched them with those huge alien eyes, its small body still trembling. Clearly unable to believe that the humans had stopped pointing weapons at its father, Marcus took a slow step forward. Then another, moving carefully so he would not frighten the child any more than it was already frightened. He knelt down, bringing himself closer to the child's level, and he looked into those compound eyes that were so different from human eyes, yet somehow showed the same emotions. "It's okay," Marcus said softly, hoping the translator could convey not just his words, but the gentleness behind them. "I'm not going to hurt him, I promise. I'm not going to hurt either of you." The child stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see it struggling to understand how this could be true when everything it knew about humans said they were enemies who had come to kill behind the child. The wounded Valori soldier stirred and made a weak sound, and the child turned its head to look at its father with obvious concern. Marcus gestured to Vasquez, who had been standing silently throughout the encounter, and she moved forward with her medical kit already in her hands. "Let her help him," Marcus said to the child. "She's a healer. She can treat his wounds." The child looked at Vasquez, then at Marcus, then at its father, and something in its posture changed as it finally allowed itself to believe that these humans meant what they said. It stepped aside, still watching carefully, and Vasquez knelt beside the wounded Valori and began examining the injury with professional efficiency. Marcus stayed where he was, kneeling on the dusty floor, watching the child that had shown more courage than many soldiers he had known, and he wondered what this moment would mean for the war, for humanity, and for his own soul that had grown so cold during 3 years of killing. Vasquez worked on the wounded Valori with steady hands, applying bandages and medical compounds that had been designed for human biology, but could at least slow the bleeding of any carbon-based life form. The alien soldier drifted in and out of consciousness, too weak to resist even if he had wanted to, and his large compound eyes flickered with confusion each time they opened and saw humans. Helping rather than killing him, Marcus remained kneeling near the child, giving it space but staying close enough to offer reassurance through his presence. And he watched as his squad adjusted to a situation none of them had ever trained for. Chun had moved to the window, keeping watch on the street outside while the medic worked. Her posture tense, but her weapon pointed at the ground. Torres stood guard at the doorway, and Marcus could see the big man struggling with what was happening, his face showing the conflict between training and something deeper. "Sarge," Torres said quietly, his voice carrying only far enough for Marcus to hear. "You know what Command is going to say about this?" Marcus nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth without letting it change his decision. "Command isn't here," he replied. "And Command didn't see what I saw." Torres was silent for a moment. Then he shook his head and returned his attention to watching the corridor, accepting the situation, even if he did not fully agree with it. The child had crept closer to its father, watching Vasquez work with a mixture of fear and hope that seemed to transcend the boundaries of species and language. Marcus studied the small alien, noting details he had missed in the first chaotic moments of the encounter. The child's shell was pale green, almost translucent in places, and patterns of darker color swirled across its surface like living art. Its eyes were proportionally larger than an adult Valori's eyes, giving it an appearance that human instincts interpreted as young and vulnerable and deserving of protection. Evolution had apparently decided that babies should look like babies across all the galaxy, and Marcus found something both strange and comforting in that thought. "He will live," Vasquez announced, sitting back on her heels and wiping blue-green fluid from her gloves. "The wound is deep, but it missed his vital organs. At least the ones I can identify from our combat medical briefings." The child made a sound that the translator rendered as a gasp of relief, and it rushed forward to kneel beside its father, touching his face with small, gentle hands. The wounded soldier's eyes opened, clearer now than they had been before, And he looked down at his child with an expression that needed no translation. Marcus had seen that look on human faces 1,000 times. In refugee camps and evacuation centers and hospitals across a dozen worlds. It was the look of a parent who had feared the worst and found unexpected hope instead. The soldier turned his head, his gaze finding Marcus, and for a long moment, the two enemies stared at each other across a distance of species and war and unimaginable violence. "Why?" the soldier asked, his voice weak but clear through the translator. "Why did you help us when you could have killed us so easily?" Marcus considered the question carefully, knowing that his answer mattered in ways he could not fully understand. "Because your child asked me to," he said simply. "And because some things are more important than war." The soldier studied him with those alien eyes that had probably watched human soldiers die on battlefields across the sector. And Marcus could not read what thoughts moved behind them. "You are not what we expected," the soldier finally said. The stories we were told about humans, they did not include this kind of mercy. Marcus felt a bitter smile cross his face, knowing exactly what kind of stories the Valori had probably heard about humanity. "We've done terrible things in this war," he admitted, seeing no point in pretending otherwise. "And your people have done terrible things to us. That is what war does to everyone who fights it." He paused, glancing at the child who watched this conversation with obvious fascination. "But I didn't join the military to kill children," Marcus continued. "I joined because I wanted to protect people. And somewhere along the way I forgot that protecting people means more than just killing enemies." The soldier was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and placed one of his clawed hands on his child's shoulder, pulling the small one close. "My name is Vareth Kilos," he said, "and this is my offspring Myra. We were trying to reach the evacuation point when the building collapsed around us." Marcus blinked at the introduction, startled by this unexpected gesture of trust from someone who should by all rights hate him and everything he represented. "I'm Marcus Cole," he replied, "Sergeant, United Earth Marine Corps. And these are my squad." The child, Mira, looked at Marcus with those huge eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 questions. "Are you going to let us go?" Myra asked, the translator giving the words a strange musical quality. "Or are you going to take us prisoner?" Marcus exchanged a glance with Vasquez, who shrugged slightly as if to say this was his decision and she would support whatever he chose. The honest truth was that Marcus did not know what he was going to do. Military protocol said he should take them prisoner and turn them over to command for interrogation. But something about that felt wrong given the circumstances. These were not soldiers captured in battle. This was an injured father and a frightened child caught in a war zone. And treating them like enemy combatants seemed like a betrayal of the very mercy he had just shown. "I don't know yet," Marcus admitted, deciding that honesty was the only appropriate response. "But I promise you this, whatever happens next, I will not let anyone hurt Myra." The soldier, Vareth, met his eyes and held them for a long moment. "I believe you," Vareth said quietly, and the words carried a weight that Marcus felt in his chest. "I do not know why, but I believe you." Chun's voice came from the window, tense and urgent. "Sarge, we've got movement outside. Looks like Valori military. Maybe a dozen of them heading this way." Marcus rose to his feet, his hand automatically going to his rifle, and he saw the fear return to Myra's eyes at the sudden change in atmosphere. The situation had just become much more complicated, and Marcus realized he was going to have to make choices that could get his entire squad killed. But as he looked at the small alien child who had shown such courage, he knew he could not go back to being the soldier he had been before this moment. Something had changed inside him, and there was no changing it back. "Okay," Marcus said, his voice calm despite the tension running through his body. "Here's what we're going to do." He did not know yet if his plan would work. did not know if anyone would survive the next hour. But he knew with absolute certainty that he would not let them take Myra or use her as leverage in this war. That was a line he would not cross, no matter what the cost. And in that moment, kneeling in a ruined building on an alien world with enemies approaching from all sides, Marcus Cole rediscovered something he thought the war had killed inside him forever. He rediscovered hope. Marcus moved to the window where Chun stood watching, keeping his body low so he would not be seen from the street below. The approaching Valori soldiers moved in tactical formation, their weapons ready, their hard shells gleaming in the orange light from distant fires. "They're searching buildings," Chun whispered. "Probably looking for survivors from the garrison." Marcus nodded, his mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to disaster one way or another. If the Valori soldiers found them here with wounded Vareth and little Myra, they would assume the worst and attack without asking questions. If Marcus and his squad engaged the enemy, the firefight would put the child at risk regardless of who won. And if they tried to run, Vareth was too injured to move quickly and would slow them down until the enemy caught them in the open. "There's another option," Vareth said weakly from his position on the floor, and Marcus turned to see the alien soldier struggling to sit up despite his wounds. "You could give us to them," Vareth continued, his compound eyes meeting Marcus's gaze. "Tell them you were using us as bait or prisoners. They would believe that, and your squad could slip away while they deal with us." Myra made a small frightened sound, but Vareth placed his hand on the child's head in a gesture of comfort. "It is all right, little one," he said softly. "These humans have already shown us more kindness than we had any right to expect. We cannot ask them to die for us." Marcus felt something twist in his chest at the resignation in Vareth's voice, at the way he was prepared to sacrifice himself to protect enemies who should by every logic of war want him dead. "No," Marcus said firmly. "That's not happening." Torres turned from his position at the door, his expression skeptical. "Sarge, with respect, that might be our best option here. Our mission is to survive and complete our objectives, not to protect enemy civilians." "I said no," Marcus repeated, and his voice carried an edge that made Torres step back. "We are not trading lives to save ourselves. That is not who we are." The big soldier stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded his acceptance. "Okay, Sarge. So what's the plan?" Marcus looked around the room, studying the walls and ceiling and floor, looking for something he could use to get everyone out of this situation alive. His eyes fell on a doorway at the back of the room, partially hidden behind a fallen shelf. And through it, he could see a stairway leading down into darkness. "Where does that go?" he asked Vareth. The alien soldier turned his head to look. Then understanding dawned in his expression. "The underground passages," Vareth said. "They connect most of the administrative buildings. They were built for security during emergencies." Marcus felt a grin spreading across his face despite the desperate circumstances. "Chun, help Vasquez get Vareth ready to move. Torres, you're on point. I want us in those tunnels before that patrol reaches this building." His squad moved with the efficiency of soldiers who trusted their leader. And within minutes, they had fashioned a crude stretcher from debris and loaded the wounded Valori onto it. Mira hovered near her father, clearly wanting to help but too small to do anything except stay out of the way. Marcus knelt down in front of the child one more time, meeting those huge frightened eyes with what he hoped was a reassuring expression. "I need you to be very brave now," he said gently. "Can you do that for me? Can you be brave for your father?" Mira straightened up, trying to make her small body look bigger and stronger than it was. "I can be brave," the child said, and Marcus heard courage in that small voice that put many adult soldiers to shame. "Good," Marcus replied. "Stay close to me and stay quiet, and I promise I will get you somewhere safe." They moved through the hidden doorway and down the stairs into tunnels that smelled of dust and old air. and Marcus led them through the darkness with only the light from his rifle to guide them. The tunnels twisted and branched in patterns that made no sense to human minds, but Vareth whispered directions from the stretcher, guiding them toward an exit point far from the enemy patrol. They walked for what felt like hours through that underground maze, and Marcus found himself talking quietly with Myra to keep the child calm in the oppressive darkness. "Tell me about your home," he said, genuinely curious despite everything. "What was it like before the war?" Myra was quiet for a moment, probably wondering why this human soldier wanted to know such things. "It was beautiful," the child finally said. "We lived near a great lake where the water was warm and the colors changed with the seasons. My father would take me swimming, and we would watch the flying creatures dance above the waves." Marcus felt a pang of something like grief at the image, thinking of his own childhood memories of swimming in the ocean near his family's home on Earth. "It sounds wonderful," he said honestly. "It was," Mira agreed. "But then the war came, and we had to leave. And now I don't know if our home is even still there." The pain in the child's voice was so raw and real that Marcus had to look away, unable to face the reminder that war destroyed innocence, regardless of which side you were born on. "Maybe when the war ends, you can go back," he said, knowing even as he spoke that the words might be nothing more than false hope. "Do you think the war will end?" Myra asked, and the question held so much longing that Marcus felt it in his bones. "All wars end eventually," he replied. "The question is what we become while we fight them, and what we choose to rebuild when the fighting stops." They emerged from the tunnels into a district far from the combat zone, where damaged buildings stood empty and silent under a sky that had begun to lighten with approaching dawn. Marcus checked his position on the tactical map and found they were only a few kilometers from the human forward operating base. Close enough to reach safely, but far enough that the return journey would take time. He also realized they were near the boundary of the Valori civilian evacuation zone, where enemy non-combatants were being gathered before being moved to safety behind their own lines. A choice lay before him, and Marcus knew it would define everything that came after. He could take Vareth and Mira back to base as prisoners, where they would be treated humanely, but separated and probably interrogated for military intelligence, or he could bring them to the evacuation zone and let them go, releasing an enemy soldier who might one day return to the battlefield and kill more humans. Torres and Chun watched him silently, waiting for his decision, and Marcus could see they understood the weight of this moment. "The evacuation zone," Marcus said finally. "We're taking them to their own people." Torres opened his mouth to protest, but something in Marcus's expression made him close it again without speaking. They moved through the empty streets as the sun rose over the devastated city. A strange procession of enemies who had become something more complicated during one long night. When they reached the perimeter of the evacuation zone, Marcus stopped and turned to face Vareth, who had managed to stand with support from Chun and Vasquez. "This is as far as we go," Marcus said. "Your people will take care of you from here." Vareth stared at him with those alien eyes that had once seemed so inhuman, but now looked almost familiar. "I do not understand why you did this," the Valori soldier said. "We are enemies. Our peoples are at war, and yet you risked everything to save us." Marcus thought about the question, thought about David and Mercy, and what it meant to be human in a universe full of darkness and violence. "Because someone had to," he finally said. "Because if we forget how to show mercy, we forget how to be human, and then we've lost the war, even if we win every battle." Myra stepped forward before Marcus could react, wrapping her small arms around his leg in an embrace that startled him so much he nearly fell over. "Thank you," the child said, looking up at him with those huge eyes. "Thank you for saving my father. I will never forget you." Marcus Cole. Marcus knelt down and carefully returned the embrace, holding the small alien child who had changed everything he thought he knew about this war. Be safe. Little one, he whispered. And when you grow up, remember that humans can be kind as well as strong. Mira nodded solemnly, then turned and helped her father limp toward the evacuation zone where other Valori were gathering under the watchful eyes of human guards. Marcus watched them go until they disappeared into the crowd. Then he turned and led his squad away without looking back. He did not know what the future would bring, did not know if this small act of mercy would matter in the grand scheme of a war that had already killed millions, but he knew he had made the right choice. And sometimes that had to be enough. The story of the human soldier and the Valori child spread like fire across both sides of the war, passed from voice to voice in quiet moments between battles and desperate struggles for survival. At first, it was just a rumor, a tale too strange to be believed, about a human sergeant who had spared an enemy and carried him to safety through underground tunnels. But as more details emerged, as witnesses came forward, and the story was confirmed by soldiers on both sides who had seen pieces of what happened that night, the rumor became legend. Vareth Kilos recovered from his wounds in a military hospital behind Valori lines, and when he was strong enough to speak, he told everyone who would listen about the humans who had shown mercy when cruelty would have been so much easier. His account spread through the Valori military and then into civilian channels, where it sparked debates and arguments and uncomfortable questions about everything they thought they knew about their enemy. They called us soft prey. Vareth told a gathering of senior officers who had come to hear his story firsthand. They said humans were weak because their bodies did not have natural armor or weapons. He paused, and his compound eyes swept across the assembled commanders with an intensity that demanded attention. They were wrong. Vareth continued. Humans are not soft because they are weak. They are soft because their strength comes from somewhere else, from inside, from something we do not have words to describe. Meanwhile, on the human side, Sergeant Marcus Cole returned to duty and refused to speak publicly about what had happened in that ruined building. But his squad talked, and their fellow soldiers talked, and soon the story reached journalists and politicians and ordinary citizens who were hungry for something other than endless reports of death and destruction. People began asking questions that had gone unasked since the war began 3 years ago. Were the Valori truly monsters, or were they beings with families and children and hopes just like humanity? Was there any possibility of peace? Or was the war destined to continue until one side was completely destroyed? What did it mean to be human in a universe where they had proven capable of both terrible violence and unexpected compassion? The questions grew louder as more stories emerged, because Marcus and his squad were not the only humans who had shown mercy during the long years of fighting. There were tales of human medics treating wounded Valori soldiers even when no one was watching, of human commanders ordering restraint when their forces could have committed atrocities, of human soldiers sharing food and water with enemy civilians caught in war zones. These stories had always existed, but they had been buried under the weight of propaganda and grief and the simple human need to hate, an enemy that had caused so much suffering. Now they rose to the surface, and they painted a picture of humanity that was far more complicated than either side had wanted to acknowledge. 6 months after that night in the ruined building, representatives from Earth and the Valori Dominion met on a neutral space station to discuss the possibility of ending the war. The negotiations were difficult, marked by distrust and anger and the weight of all the blood that had been spilled by both sides. But they continued, day after day, because something had changed in the way each side saw the other. The breakthrough came when a young Valori diplomat stood before the assembly and shared a story that had been given to her by her father, a wounded soldier who had been saved by humans. "I am Myra," she said, and her voice was steady despite the thousands of eyes watching her. And I am alive because a human soldier chose mercy instead of hatred. She told the story of that night, of her father's wounds and her desperate plea, and the human sergeant who had lowered his weapon when every instinct must have told him to fire. Marcus Cole did not save us because he was ordered to. Mira continued, he saved us because he chose to see us as people instead of enemies. And that choice was harder than pulling a trigger. The assembly was silent as she spoke. Representatives from both species, listening to words that challenged everything they thought they knew about each other. This war began because we saw each other as threats to be eliminated. Myra said, but Marcus Cole showed me that humans can choose a different path. They can be warriors and protectors at the same time. Fierce and gentle, strong and kind. She paused, looking out at the assembled diplomats with eyes that had grown wise beyond her years. If one human soldier can make that choice in the middle of a battle, then surely we can make the same choice here, in this room, when no one is shooting at us. The Treaty of Vareth was signed 3 weeks later, ending a war that had killed tens of millions and devastated dozens of worlds. It was not a perfect peace, and the scars of the conflict would take generations to heal. But it was a beginning at the signing ceremony. The Valori High Ambassador made a speech that would be remembered for centuries. We called humans soft prey because we did not understand them, he said, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. We thought their lack of natural armor made them weak. But we were fools. He turned to look at the human delegation, his compound eyes reflecting the light of 100 cameras. Humans do not need armor because their spirits do not require protection, the ambassador continued. They carry their strength inside them, in their capacity for both wrath and grace. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with hard-won wisdom. Do not make our mistake, he said, addressing the watching galaxy. Do not wake the humans to war, but if you must, do not give them reason to hate you, because a human who hates is terrible beyond measure. His expression softened, and something like wonder entered his voice. But a human who loves, a human who shows mercy, a human who chooses compassion even in the darkness of war, that human will move the stars themselves, far away on Earth. Marcus Cole watched the ceremony on a screen in his brother's memorial garden, surrounded by flowers that David had planted years ago. He thought about the child who had stood between him and an enemy soldier, about the courage it had taken for such a small being to face weapons it could not hope to survive. He thought about Vareth, who had been willing to sacrifice himself so that enemies could escape, about the unexpected trust they had found in each other during that long night, and he thought about David, whose gentle spirit had guided him toward mercy, even when hatred would have been so much easier. I hope you can see this, Marcus whispered to the wind that stirred the flowers. I hope you know that you were right all along. The war was over, but the story of the human soldier and the alien child was just beginning. It spread across the galaxy in the years that followed, carried by traders and travelers and explorers who ventured into the vast darkness between stars. It became a legend, then a myth, then a truth that every species in the known universe learned eventually humanity was dangerous, not because of their weapons or their numbers, or their stubborn refusal to surrender. Humanity was dangerous because they could hate with all their hearts and still choose to love, could wage terrible war and still show impossible mercy, could burn worlds and save children in the same breath. The galaxy learned to respect humanity, not through fear alone, but through wonder at a species that contained such contradictions without being torn apart by them. And in the end, that was humanity's greatest victory, not the battles they won or the enemies they defeated, but the moment when a soldier lowered his weapon because a child asked him to. That single choice, repeated across 1,000 worlds and 1,000,000 years, was what made humanity worthy of the stars, because anyone could conquer through strength, but only humans could conquer through compassion. And that made all the difference.